Good afternoon. I'm Ron Agam, a proud member of 92Y Talks Advisory Committee. We would like to thank Tom Kaplan for his sponsorship of 92nd Y Talks. I am delighted to welcome you to understanding the new Israeli government, prospect for peace, and the role of the US. We are thrilled to have four esteemed experts to share their expertise on this most timely topic that has wide-ranging implications for the entire Middle East. Let me briefly introduce you each of our guests. Our moderator, Elise Labott, is the founder of 2 Points, a digital media platform that aims to engage, inform, and inspire youth to solve today's most pressing global challenges, and an adjunct professor at American University School of International Service. Prior to joining American University, she was a practitioner in residence at Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service. Elise has reported on every major global since joining CNN in 2000 and reported extensively on the conflicts in Syria, Ukraine, Israel, and US tensions with Iran. Now, for our panel, Aaron David Miller is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on US foreign policy and American diplomacy. Between 1978 and 2003, he served as a State Department Middle East historian, analyst, negotiator, and an advisor in Democratic and Republican administration. He is a CNN Global Affairs analyst and author of most recently of The End of Greatness, Why America Can Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. Khalil Shakiki is a professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. He is also a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. He is a co-founder of the Arab Barometer and the Arab Reform Initiative and a co-author of the annual report on the Arab Democracy Index. Since 1993, Dr. Shakiki has conducted hundreds of polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And since 2000, dozens of polls among Israelis. David Horovitz is the founder editor of the Times of Israel, which launched in 2012 and now has an average of some 8 million monthly users and over 30 million monthly page views. The Times of Israel, which provides independent coverage of Israel, the region, and the Jewish world, is the author of Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, and 2000, A Little Too Close to God, The Thrill of Panic of a Life in Israel. Let me also invite you to enter your question in the chat of the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, please welcome our esteemed guests.
Thank you, Ron. And thank you to the 92nd Street Y Talks. We're thrilled to be having this conversation at such a timely juncture in both regional politics and specifically Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and of course here in America. And I can't think of a more amazing, really dream panel. As a columnist for Foreign Policy Magazine, and before that with CNN, I've relied on David, Khalil, and Aaron in my own work, and we couldn't be in better hands to explain all of the developments in Israel and the Palestinian territories and how that affects American politics here. So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. David, let's set the scene for us. We had this rare show of unity among Israeli parties to form this new government. Talk to us about this kind of motley crew of parties and how the Israelis see it. After 12 years of Benjamin Netanyahu, we transitioned to a different prime minister, and it's quite a change, I'd say, on the ground.
Yeah, hi Elise, hi everybody. I'm very pleased to be on this panel, and good to speak to you all, and didn't even have to fly in to do it. So yeah. So yeah, we changed government after 12 years, which you can say in a sentence, but it's a radical thing. My kids are in their mid and late 20s. They're quite savvy people. They don't really remember in Israel when Netanyahu was not the prime minister. And I think the first thing to say, and I suppose we should take it for granted, but it had been so long since we transitioned to a different government that the fact that we did it, the transition, I have to tell you, is not complete, because I remember there was an inauguration over at your end, and after the president is inaugurated, he goes to the White House. After Prime Minister Netanyahu was no longer Prime Minister and Naftali Bennett had taken over, Netanyahu went straight back to the Prime Minister's residence. And although this happened 15 days ago, he's been there ever since. We could be doing this conversation in a week and he'll still be there, because the agreement that he reached with Bennett is he gets about 4 weeks to pack his bags and move to one of his other residences that isn't the official Prime Minister's residence. But they did the transition. Bennett has taken over as Prime Minister. And as you say, unity, well, they're calling it a unity government. They've also called it a change government. Netanyahu calls it a dangerous left-wing government. But the fact is, it's the most radically diverse coalition that we've ever had in Israeli history. We have this semi-dysfunctional, very pure electoral system. 13 parties got seats in the Knesset, only 120 seats, 13 parties divided them, and 8 of those parties are in this coalition. And they come from 3 from the right, from Netanyahu's own ideological part of the spectrum, 2 from somewhere in the center, 2 from the left, and 1 conservative Islamic party. And if that sounds beyond implausible, well, it's like I say, we've never had anything like this before. And really, just to in a sentence, to explain how this came to be, Israel has shifted to the right, certainly in the last 20 years. Second Intifada, the suicide bombings, they destroyed Israelis' faith in compromise. And therefore, it's not surprising if I tell you the Knesset is a majority right-wing Knesset. So why do we not have a right-wing government? Because there's also a majority in the Knesset that wanted to see the back of Netanyahu. His own ideological allies, people who'd worked with him, who'd served in his governments, his former cabinet secretary, his former bureau chief, and so on, they all campaigned against him. And when all the arithmetic was done, this was the coalition that emerged, a coalition of center, right, left, and an Arab party whose real only glue is seeking to have ended Netanyahu's 12 years in power. I don't know what they're going to do with that. Ideologically, they're all going to have to put their dreams aside, as our new Prime Minister Naftali Bennett puts it. There's a lot that can be done consensually. We haven't had a budget in this country for all of 2020 and so far of 2021. There's basic fundamental things that were not being done. So for the time being, they're tackling the basics. How long they'll last, what they'll be able to do, we can talk about that later. It's not going to be easy for them.
Just to put a kind of button on this, and in fact that they got rid of Netanyahu, and it is, the government has moved to the right, the country has moved to the right. What was it? And I think a lot of people here in this country might resonate here. What was it about Netanyahu, given that ideologically and politically, and in terms of his policies, many people supported? What was it about him that everyone said, yeah, this guy's got to go?
Okay, so first of all, not everyone, right? Just a slight majority. And it was, we had 4 elections that were basically referenda on Netanyahu, the man who is widely appreciated in Israel of having kept the country relatively safe. We have conscription here. That's the big issue usually, security. While Netanyahu kept the country fairly safe, is not seen as a military adventurer, articulate on the world stage, and really relevantly for now, the guy who hectored Albert Bourla of Pfizer phoned him 30 times. So that Israel would beat the world really in getting much of its population vaccinated. But he lost because, along with those credits, there was a sense that he is divisive, I would say, in terms of the Israeli electorate, stirring up sectors of the electorate against each other, fighting a corruption battle in the cause of protesting his innocence, tackling, I would say, battering away at law enforcement, at some of the key pillars of our democracy. And the extraordinary thing is that ultimately in this election and the negotiations that followed it, his ideological allies, three parties, said, you know what, for all that we share his broad vision of the region and so on, we think he's bad for Israel. Just to give you that one thing, Gideon Sa'ar, his former cabinet secretary, set up a new party. It's in this new government. He said, if you want Netanyahu as prime minister, do not vote for my party. I think our top priority is to get rid of Netanyahu. That's the level that it had reached.
So Khalil, talk to us about the Palestinian perspective. What are you hearing on the ground? How do you see it? And what are your polls telling you about whether this new Israeli government, if Palestinians feel any differently about the future?
Thank you, Elise. It's good to be with you. As expected, there is, of course, a lot of division among Palestinians. But if you just look at where the public is, it seems there is a semi-consensus that this is not going to be any different than any previous Netanyahu government. But if you look at the elite of the Palestinian Authority, those who come from Fatah, essentially, you'll find that there is, a little bit of optimism. This optimism, and perhaps a wait-and-see attitude, is driven by, what David has been speaking about. It is not Netanyahu. And for 12 years, the expectations have been that Netanyahu is not going to move forward with the political process towards a two-state solution. He will do his best to destroy that option. He's not going to be friendly to the Palestinian Authority, not too friendly to Hamas either. He will keep the Palestinians divided and so on and so forth. So it is not Netanyahu. That is definitely why we see some little optimism among the elite. But there are other reasons why the elite is a little bit optimistic. These are related to things that also David has spoken about, and these are the dynamics that are generated by the nature of the coalition. With people from the center and left in the government, the expectation is that this government will not do any fundamental change to the status quo, such as those that Netanyahu is contemplating, from annexation to major settlement expansion plans and so on and so forth. So this is a dynamic that is attributed to the nature of the coalition. That means at least there is room for improvement in Israeli-Palestinian relations, as long as Israel doesn't embark in any major change in policy as those that were being thought of in 2019 and 2020. There's a second reason, and David has also spoken about that, and that is the fact that for the first time in the history of the state, there is an Arab party. It is an Islamic party, and it's not a friendly, therefore, to the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. But Mansour Abbas is seen as someone who has, in fact, implemented what our Abbas, what Mahmoud Abbas would have wanted, to see an Israeli Arab party joining the Israeli coalition. In the past, the Palestinian Authority had done its best to try and mediate between various groups to allow the creation of such a coalition, to allow the creation of a joint Jewish Arab party that could compete in the elections. The fact that Mansour Abbas had done it and not somebody else might not be thrilling to the PA, but at least it opens the door. If, of course, Mansour Abbas does not succeed, this would, of course, be disastrous, because it could mean that the approach to integrating Israeli Arabs into the state and eventually talking about a two-state solution is not going to work. But if he succeeds, then it opens the door for the future of Arab integration, and that the PA hopes would help to moderate the attitudes of any Israeli government in which Israeli Arab parties are represented. That if this is done with a right-wing prime minister, future right-wing prime minister, center or left, will also be willing to invite Arab parties to participate. If it does indeed improve conditions for Israeli Arabs, then this would certainly be an invitation for Israeli Arabs to vote for parties that are willing to join the coalition in the future. So these are the elements of why the PA is a little bit optimistic. But as I said, the public and most of the opposition elite is unhappy with, well, the word unhappy perhaps is not the right word, but not optimistic. And they're not optimistic because they see this is a right-wing government led by somebody who sits to the right of Netanyahu, and they don't expect him to be willing to improve relations either with Gaza or the West Bank.
Okay, I want to get back in a bit to how this is actually going to benefit Israeli Arabs and Palestinians living inside of Israel. But first, Aaron, and we'll get deeper also into the American Jewish community in a bit, but talk about how this affects the new government and the new face of the Israel. How does this affect the Biden administration approach towards Israel, if it does at all?
Thanks, Elise, and it's great to be here with you and David and Khalil, three of my favorite people. I think the Biden administration has basically caught a break. And I think while the champagne corks may not be popping in Washington, I think the champagne may have come out of the closet. It may be put into the refrigerator. You now have an Israeli government not headed by Benjamin Netanyahu. I think the tone clearly is going to change. Frankly, it's raining Israelis. Tony Blinken met with Yair Lapid yesterday in Rome. At 4 o'clock today, Ruvi Rivlin will meet with the president. It took Joe Biden 3 weeks to call Benjamin Netanyahu. He phoned Naftali Bennett the same day that the government was announced and won its vote of confidence. Barak Ravid is carrying a story this morning that the White House is discussing dates as early as July 18th for a meeting between Biden and Bennett. And there will be a meeting between Lapid and Biden, since he's the alternate prime minister, probably within the next several months. I think there's a sense that a measure of trust in managing the two issues that separate the United States and Israel might be a little easier. One, on how to deal with the Palestinian issue, manage, I said, not resolve. And second, it's clear that while Naftali Bennett and Rivlin and Lapid have both brought very tough messages to the administration on the dangers of reentry into the JCPOA. For Bennett, with 6 seats and 49 years old, he's got a lot of other stuff to do and is not going to be able to wage the campaign. It's not his signature issue. He won't play the Republicans against the Democrats as Netanyahu did. He will not assertively court the evangelical community here at the expense of the Jewish community. So I think there's a collective sigh of relief that, in fact, and this is where it gets complicated, Biden may be able to do what he wanted to do from the beginning, which is to park the Israeli-Palestinian issue somewhere so that he can concentrate on the real problem facing his presidency and the Republic. And, you know, I usually start my analysis in other administrations by looking at the region. I don't think that's the point of departure here. This president probably believes there is no single foreign policy issue out there that is more potentially damaging to his presidency or the future of our republic than the 3 or 4 crises that currently face him. And that leaves a relatively small bandwidth to pursue transformative foreign policies abroad. I think, last point, that Biden envisions himself much in the style and manner of FDR and LBJ as a potentially transformative president at home, seeking to do nothing less than to reimagine the role of the federal government in an incredible transformation of the American economy and even its social structure. But unlike LBJ and FDR, Biden does not have the majorities. And I'll just close again with where I began, which is the focus on domestic politics. Charlie Cook of the Cook Report looked at every administration since 1946 and how the president's party performed in the first midterms, with the exception, and there were 3 exceptions, 1934, 1998, and 2004. In every other case, the president's party lost seats in the first midterms. The average loss in the House is 22 seats and 3 in the Senate. If that occurs or anything like that occurs in 2022, Joe Biden's domestic agenda is over. The Israeli-Palestinian issue is simply not a priority for this administration. If there is a Middle East priority, it's re-entering the JCPOA. And frankly, I'm not even so sure that is such an urgent necessity, given the bad political hits the president is going to take once that agreement, if that agreement is actually signed.
Well, I think to bring it back to the Israeli issue, I think, under Trump, certainly, I think the Israel-Palestinian issue and certainly Israel became more of a partisan issue. Now, I think in terms of the administration and Congress, I think maybe we'll have much more of a bipartisan approach. David, let's talk about, we talked about how extraordinary this is, but I also, what's really extraordinary to me is how both Lapid and Bennett, obviously politics are involved and they're looking for their political future, but they said, okay, I'm going to put away my my long-term political gains. I'm going to look at what I can do for my country right now and kind of put, moving forward first. So what are the government's priorities expected to be? How much realistically can they get done? And does the Israeli mainstream like this? I mean, I think, as you said in the beginning, we're going back to some domestic priorities that maybe have been neglected over during Netanyahu's term. And maybe, I've talked to some Israelis on the ground that say, hey, there's an opportunity here to get a lot of stuff, education, public works, infrastructure done, just like here in this country, maybe, that we haven't had attention to before, because we won't be focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, so you have to understand how dysfunctional Israeli politics had become. And when you realize that, you realize how much that they will be able to do that is just basic, and that it's just astounding that it didn't happen. So I mentioned the budget. We don't have a budget, but even something as basic as, we work Sunday to Thursday in Israel. So in normal times, the cabinet meets on Sunday morning, starts the week with a cabinet meeting. Well, in the last government, which was a Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, dysfunctional, endlessly bickering coalition, they couldn't even agree on the agenda for the cabinet meeting some weeks, and therefore they didn't meet. Israel's most important decision-making body, which is called the Security Cabinet or the Inner Cabinet, barely met, even though there are crises nonstop in the region. So we're moving simply by dint of the fact that on Sunday they had a cabinet meeting. That's already progress. 36 diplomatic appointments that were held up for months were approved right away. A commission of inquiry was ordered into a disaster at a religious festival in the north a few weeks ago. 45 ultra-Orthodox pilgrims were killed. The ultra-Orthodox parties prevented an inquiry being established because they thought they get the blame. New government comes in, they set up the inquiry. So really, there is a great deal of room for obvious, consensual, mainstream supported basic steps. And that's what you can see the government beginning to take. But I don't think, we should say what they've been saying, which is you listen to Bennett and you listen to Lapid, and they're saying things like, where we agree, we will advance. We're not going to realize our dreams. We're not going to cross ideological red lines. And they are going to try and move forward within those parameters. But that doesn't rule out some changes of tone. I think it's significant. It didn't come to pass. But days after the new coalition took office, the new health minister from Meretz organized the first delivery of vaccines to the Palestinian Authority. Now, that's great news, right? And Israel is going to deliver 1 million vaccines, some of which run out at the end of June. And once the PA took delivery, they sent them back, the first 100,000, because they said, hey, they're expiring too soon. And Israel said, these are the exact vaccines that we're using right now on our people. Of course they're expiring soon. That's the way it works. The next batch would have a later date. So it didn't work out, which kind of underlines the deeper problems. But there was a will to do something that hadn't been done. At the same time, there's an illegal West Bank outpost called Evyatar, which nobody credible claims is legal and which was about to be, or was supposed to be, dismantled. And today, some kind of arrangement may have been made. It will not be dismantled. The army will stay there. The civilian residents will leave. Maybe a yeshiva will be set up there. This gives you a sense that it's going to be hard to do anything dramatic. They're going to try and accommodate each other. It's going to be very difficult. And maybe just the last point to give people the parameters. We have a prime minister now who is indeed to the right of Netanyahu on the Palestinian issue. In other words, Bennett would annex 60% of the West Bank, not just the Jordan Valley and the settlements, but all of what is known as Area C, in a perfect world for Bennett. Meretz, which is a partner in this coalition, would go back to the 67 lines. So you can see how vast is the gulf between them. So in terms of actual substantive steps, we're right to expect very little. In terms of potential for a change of tone, maybe. And judging from what Khalil said, maybe if there's a changed tone, if there's at least better communication, some kind of improved interaction, then you start to build a little bit of confidence on both sides among ordinary people. I'm being really upbeat here, which is totally out of character for me. But just maybe you create a circumstance where a little further down the road, there's more support on both sides for wary efforts to make real progress. So, let's allow ourselves the teeniest modicum of optimism. It will be dashed shortly, I'm sure, but still, let's try.
Yes, optimism. Khalil, on that point, Mansour Abbas, for his participation and his party's participation in this government, it does seem like he was able to secure specific programs for Israeli Arabs and Palestinians living inside of Israel. How much, while as David said, and as you've been saying, we may not expect much on the actual kind of, negotiations or movement towards a two-state solution. But if he feels that he could be able to deliver for Israeli Arabs, how do you see that playing out? Do you think that there's more opportunity to improve the quality of life for those people living inside Israel proper?
Absolutely. I think if he succeeds, the three main areas where he and those who support him would like to see change, of course, are related to budget allocations to Arab communities, to the state to begin to seriously address and combat the violence that is prevailing, huge levels of violence within the Arab society, and building permits and stopping all the demolition of homes that are taking place, homes that have been built because the state won't grant permits. So these are some of the issues that are, if he succeeds in these areas, if he can produce results that people can see, I expect him and his party to actually manage to significantly change attitudes of Israeli Arabs regarding integration into the political system and entering coalitions. There's the attitude of Israeli Arabs is very soft on this, and a little bit of success could go a long way. There is no expectation among this party members or the Arab community at large that this participation will mean progress in the Israeli-Palestinian file. I think the idea here is that this issue is not one that would welcome the involvement of Israeli Arabs, and that Israeli Arabs need to focus on the issues that concern them. So now for the PA, of course, if he succeeds in these issues, service-related issues, it means that future coalitions will begin to look and rely on Israeli Arabs participating, and this will help to indirectly moderate the positions of the various Israeli governments, and will give the PA the opportunity to begin to build coalitions within the Arab community. And again, I don't think that even the Palestinian Authority itself and its elite expect Mansour Abbas to be pressing Israel on the Palestinian-Israeli question. Although, of course, if there is violence, particularly between Hamas and Israel, remember what David said, this is an Islamic political party. Its roots is the Muslim Brothers, and in fact, its ideology is based on that. So for them, Hamas is a sister organization, and the conflict with Gaza is going to be one area where the participation of this political party in the Israeli coalition will be tested the most.
So Aaron, let's get into the Gaza conflict, really post-fighting. The U.S. had this verbiage that's kind of been bandied around for a while during the Biden campaign about equal measures of dignity, freedom, and security, more attention to the human rights for Palestinians, not necessarily, and I feel that this is the shift, not as a reward after the conflict in a political context, but as an unalienable right. Meaning, we're not going to get to a two-state solution right now, but we do need to improve the quality of life and the hope for Palestinians on the ground. So talk to us about where that comes from. Obviously, there's a big liberal, progressive camp in the US that's fighting for this. How do American Jews feel about that? And is this the new kind of frame that the US is going to approach? Since, as you said, it's not going to be going for negotiations, maybe you could have some improvement of actually quality of life.
It's an interesting formulation. I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, and I don't want to speculate. Tony Blinken used it, freedom, dignity. I think he may even talked about equality. The real question is with any rhetoric, and George Shultz once said, if you don't have a policy, don't give a speech, or alternatively, give a speech as a substitute for a policy. I'm not entirely sure where that framing and formulation actually goes. Because if you're talking about human rights and equality for Palestinians inside the Green Line or in the occupied West Bank and Gaza and in East Jerusalem, you confront a reality. Why don't the Palestinians have a measure of freedom and equality in these areas? Well, that leads you to another conclusion, which has you run frontally into the question of the Israeli occupation. And if I'm correct in my own analysis that domestic politics will constrain this administration's willingness to not only fracture the government, but to really pressure and squeeze the new Israeli government, this is a formulation that it seems to me is hard to actually implement. There are a lot of things the administration has been doing and will do. At some point, they will announce a consul general. At some point, the new the new U.S. ambassador will be confirmed. They are clearly establishing a high-level dialogue with the Palestinian Authority. They've resumed some measure of assistance, both with respect to UNRWA and security assistance. They're pushing to restore the status quo on the Temple Mount Haram HaSharif, which basically is everyone can visit, but only Muslims can pray. And they want to reestablish Jordan's credibility as custodian of that area. But again, the tough decision the one I don't think this administration wants to confront is, what do you do with respect to Israeli policies and practices toward the Palestinians? What do you do about housing demolitions? What do you do if the Supreme Court continues to rule that Sheikh Jarrah, that the Jewish owners have the legal right to evict what could be as many as 300 Palestinians from that area? What do you do if the Israelis engage in additional settlement activity? I think David and Khalil are probably right that the new government will seek to constrain itself and maintain a status quo. But it is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, after all. And the status quo is not going to be maintained. So at some point, the administration is going to face the awkward and unpleasant task of trying to figure out what to do in the event the Israelis take a step that they don't like. I just don't believe, back to your initial question, the logical implication of saying that Palestinians should have equality, freedom, live in dignity is ending the Israeli occupation. How do you improve the equality, freedom, and dignity of Palestinians? I mean, if they're half measures, sure, bring them on. I've been around the block on this one for many years, and I'm not sure there is a half measure. Therefore, I think the administration has defined a principle that's going to be very difficult for them to actually implement.
Okay, David, talk to us. Okay, so does this new tone and this new approach to we don't want to do anything to rock the boat, is this new Israeli government willing to look at things in this new way? So we're taking the pressure off major actions either way, in terms of negotiations, two-state solution, West Bank. Would it be more acceptable to the Israeli government and the mainstream to ease some of these constraints, security permitted? I personally think a lot of times some of these security measures are used as a justification for, some of these more constraints. But anyway, is the Israeli mainstream more amenable to easing some of the constraints of the occupation, improving the quality of life for Palestinians without a political deal? It seems that the army does, and the Israeli military and foreign policy establishment would support some of easing of constraints, security permitted.
Yeah, the army and the Palestinian Authority, people don't talk about it a great deal, but there is, ongoing cooperation, even sometimes when the PA is saying they're stopping it or that they've stopped it. But they're, that's what keeps the conflict managed, I suppose. I want to add the other half to some of the things that Aaron said. Israelis are on the horns of this dilemma, which I think, by the way, previous American administrations that tried to make progress on the Palestinian front did not sufficiently internalize. Israel broadly wants to separate from the Palestinians if it's safe to do so. If we can't find a way to separate from the Palestinians, then we are together forever between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, then either there's a Jewish minority in that larger Israel, or Israeli democracy is subverted, and the other half, or the majority who are not Jewish, have unequal rights. So Israel wants to be democratic and it wants a Jewish majority. So if it can find a way to safely separate from the Palestinians, I still think mainstream Israel would want to do so. The problem is that our recent history has moved that mainstream to the right, because when Israel left southern Lebanon in 2000, Hezbollah filled the vacuum, we had war, and now they have 100,000 missiles pointing at Israel. When we left Gaza in 2005, adjacent territory, Hamas took over, and we've had endless conflict, and by the way, demonization and delegitimization as well. And were Israel, Israel did pull out of the major West Bank cities under the Oslo process. There then ensued the second intifada. So if it were to relinquish, if it were to end the occupation, as Aaron put it, the concern in Israel is that it would suffer terribly. The country would be paralyzed and attacked and so on. And therefore, this dreadful dilemma that you have in Israel, which is a recipe, I think, for no progress in the immediate future. And that's why I spoke about tone, and Khalil, interestingly, spoke about tone. I don't think that there is a way to make a breakthrough in the foreseeable future. I think the only, if the Americans were seeking my advice, which of course they certainly shouldn't and probably won't, focus on education, focus on confronting both sides of this conflict with the inconvenience of the conflicting narratives, breed a little bit of tolerance, and gradually create a tone in which you have more confidence and a possibility of making progress. I don't think it's not an Israeli need, quite the reverse. I think Israel, crucially, must find a way to try to be able to separate safely from the Palestinians. I don't think there can be a major breakthrough, but I think a well-intentioned American administration can help. And to get to your question there, I do think that between Bennett and Lapid, crucially, who are very good together, who've got, they're very different politically, but they get on well. I don't think either of them is going to be trying to make life miserable for the other. Bennett is finished politically if this government collapses soon. Lapid put aside his ambitions to achieve this government. I don't think they're going to want to rock the boat on the Palestinian issue. I think they're going to try and find areas where both are comfortable with what can be achieved.
Okay, I want to remind everybody, please put your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. And we're going to go to those questions in a few minutes. So put your questions in the chat. Please keep them short so we can get to as many as possible. Khalil, so let's say we're being optimistic here that the Israelis, and with pressure from Americans, are willing to ease up a little bit, maybe have a different tone with the Palestinians, offer some more quality of life issues. Maybe this would give the Palestinians some space to get their own act together. Now, we've talked about how Hamas did very well in this conflict strategically, both as a defender of the Palestinian cause, of Jerusalem, after kind of weeks of tension and years of really unresolved grievances. And they filled this vacuum, I feel, by left, that President Abbas and the Palestinian leadership has been leaving. So talk to us about how you see the situation among the Palestinians. You see this greater crackdown on dissent. There was the brutal murder of one of the PA's critics, Nizar Banat, and now protests are breaking out in the West Bank. What is the feeling about this Palestinian government, and how do we help them? What would you advise in terms of helping them to create a better political space to deal with the Israelis? You're on mute, Khalil.
All right. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Look, there is no doubt that, and I in answering your question, I also want to comment a little bit on what Aaron said and David. We are confronting very serious challenges in any effort to even to maintain the status quo, not to mention moving forward. We are likely to confront very, very serious challenges, and some of those are domestic challenges. The Palestinian Authority is at weakest point in its entire history. It has never been, things have never been as bad as they are right now for Abbas and his political party and the entire ruling elite. These domestic conditions that Abbas is responsible for, in my view, have led to the May war between Israel and Hamas by the decision to postpone or cancel the elections. But that confrontation had its own dynamic. The impact of the perception that Hamas has won the confrontation is that, and while the PA was running away from a confrontation with Israel over the elections in East Jerusalem, is creating for the Palestinians a new dynamic, one in which they do not turn to the PA any longer to resolve issues with Israel or to impact Israeli policy, but to Hamas. They want Hamas. The majority of the Palestinian public in our latest survey say that Hamas, not Abbas, not Fatah, should represent and lead the Palestinian people. Hamas is now, again, this is temporary probably, but Hamas is today the most popular Palestinian factions. If elections are held today, Hamas will do very, very well. Abbas isn't going to do well at all. He definitely will lose elections. But that is what Palestinians need. They need to go to elections. The government needs to have legitimacy and credibility if it is to be able to challenge Hamas. So if we are afraid that Hamas will win, Hamas is winning and will continue to win in any case. So domestically speaking, the challenge is how do you restore legitimacy to a Palestinian government? David spoke about returning the vaccine, which we need so much. This is a vaccine. This is a deal that was facilitated by the Pfizer company. So the Palestinians were supposed to give Israel an equal number of doses when our turn comes for Pfizer to send us these doses. And Israel sent us the vaccine. But because the PA knew that this is controversial, that the public will not like it, it kept it hidden from the public. And it was the Israeli media that broke the story. And when it reached the Palestinian media, the media said, what the Israelis gave us, the 90,000 or so that David spoke about earlier, the Palestinian media said the date of expiry has arrived already. So what was the immediate consequence of that? That people will now, if you give it to people, people will think that they are being given a useless vaccine. And it will mean losing confidence in the entire process of vaccination. The PA had no alternative but to return that to the Israelis. It is a sign of weakness, a sign of understanding that the government does not have legitimacy, it does not have credibility, it can explain to the public what is going on. So in any future attempt to try and improve relations, the PA will continue to be under the same constraints. So this is a major domestic constraint. But there is another, even larger constraint that is not just domestic, but also related to US policy. And that is the belief that this conflict is not ripe for resolution. If you think it is not, and most Israelis think that, most Palestinians think that, they think the other side is not ready for peace. They think the other side either doesn't want it, or the conditions haven't yet reached the point where the other side has no choice but to go into peace. And so, and of course, this is also true now in Washington, based on the previous 15 years of negotiations. The conclusion is the conflict is not ripe for resolution. The problem is, as we wait for it to ripen for resolution, things on the ground make it impossible to go back to where we were before. And in other words, instead of the prospects for ripening improves, it does not. In fact, it becomes tougher for things in the future, unless we're able to maintain the prospect for a two-state solution. How do you do that? Well, is Biden going to tell the new Israeli prime minister, I want you to say that you are in favor of a two-state solution? Bennett is going to tell him to go to take a hike. He's not going to say that. And is he going to say to him, you cannot build more settlements? Well, again, he will tell him, take a hike, which means the administration isn't going to do that in any way. So the administration policy is to support a two-state solution, but it's not going to make sure that the prospect is maintained in the meanwhile, while it thinks that the two parties are not ready yet for that resolution. The choice, I think, for the administration right now is to prepare for the future. The future is what David spoke about. If we don't want to go now into a two-state solution, despite the difficulties, we have to go into something else. And that something else is democracy, equality for all between the river and the sea. The administration has to put the two sides in front of a mirror and say to them, you have one of these two alternatives. There is no third alternative. And what policy you now decide on is going to determine that outcome eventually. So if you don't like a two-state solution and 67 lines and so on and so forth, well, then you have to consider equality. And is the Biden administration ready for that? Absolutely not. So what happens? Well, the next confrontation is not going to be between the PA and Bennett. It will be with Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, and Bennett. It will be with Sinwar. It will be with Daif. It will be war and conflict. But that is going to spill over into the West Bank. And if Abbas is weak already, imagine how it will be when the next war comes. And so I'm afraid if we wait for things to improve or ripen, if we do not push the PA to go to elections, if we don't push the two sides to go towards ending occupation and building a two-state solution, we're just waiting for the next war, and the prospects for peace will definitely diminish over time.
Well, as usual, Khalil answered about 4 or 5 of our audience questions in that one answer. Obviously, what are the practicalities of a two-state solution from the point of democracies? Not very high right now, but democracy is the only way. And look, Aaron, there are a lot, as Khalil said, and as David said, a lot of fears among, both Israelis and Palestinians that, Hamas, a Palestinian state, if we don't, do something, would be ruled by Hamas. And obviously that's not going to help the Palestinians either in the short or the long term. So from the US perspective, how can the US foster a more moderate, democratic Palestinian leadership that can move forward in the way that David and Khalil have talked about?
You're asking a basic question that lies at the heart of so many American foreign policy failures, and not just in the Middle East. We're about to withdraw completely from Afghanistan. We've been in Iraq since 2003. You have a degree of dysfunction in the face of American efforts over a 20-year period, with the expenditure of billions of dollars in resources, the deployment of hundreds of thousands of American forces. Give me one example where the United States, since 1945, and the work that they did in Europe, in Japan, and in Germany, ended up creating a fundamental change in the politics of another nation through persuasion, through incentives, perhaps even through disincentives. We can no more fundamentally change the character of the Palestinian Authority than we could fundamentally change. And I know that there's many who say, you must change it. You must summon the international community and bring massive pressure, certainly against the Israelis. That's the argument. But I submit as evidence A through Z, America's track record over the course of the last 7 decades. Where has the United States interceded in the internal politics of another nation when in fact those politics were somehow ameliorated in a transformative, meaningful, significant way to transition from an authoritarian, highly centralized structure to a democratic polity, which I might add is under Israeli occupation now? I just don't think we do this well. And that's why I think I mean, there are things that we can do. David and
like what? I mean, I would say, they basically don't crack down on Abbas for any of the corruption, any of the cracking down on dissent that he's doing because of this, because of exactly what you say. He's under occupation. He's a weak leader. We have to support him, but that gives him a green light.
If we want Mahmoud Abbas out, then don't do everything that the Biden administration is doing right now. Cut off all assistance. Do it, Trump, because that's basically what you're suggesting. They didn't care about Abbas. They probably would have been happier if he would have left, although they had no alternative, they wanted a 22-state solution, not a 2-state solution. That's what Jared Kushner essentially told me. They wanted Arab state Israeli recognition. That was their peace process. So I don't have an answer for you, because I don't think there is an answer. In 2006, the Bush administration decided there should be free and fair elections in Palestine. And guess what happened? You ended up with a situation that ultimately led to Hamas's takeover of Gaza. So we don't do this well, and let alone bringing pressure on the Israelis, which we are not going to do, it seems to me, in this administration. So I'd fall back on the handful of steps that we've already identified. Foster an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue on issues of a practical nature. Preserve the status quo on the Temple Mount and the Haram, so you don't have another blow up in Jerusalem. Try to reason with the Israelis with respect to housing demolitions and evictions, even though that's caught up in the legal process. Discourage them from large-scale settlement activity, high-profile settlement activity. I defer to Khalil on this, but if you want to empower Abbas, what kinds of things would make Mahmoud Abbas more credible within the eyes of the Palestinian community? He needs stuff from the Israelis. And frankly, I'm not sure they're in a position to give him what he needs.
Khalil, just quickly, what is he? Is it too late for Abbas, or is there anything? I mean, look, he's old, he's going to die soon. How does the U.S. foster a more democratic, moderate leadership that is acceptable to the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Look, I think improved Israeli-Palestinian relations, improved economic conditions for the Palestinians will go a long way to create conditions for a transition in the domestic political scene. Those who will vote for Hamas, those who share Hamas's value system, represent 1/3 of the Palestinian public. If we went to elections when they were supposed to take place last May, Hamas would have won 1/3 of the votes of the Palestinian public. In 6 months from now, if we go to elections, and in the meanwhile, there are no major disruptions between Israelis and Palestinians, economic conditions are not worsening. If we go to elections at that time, my guess would be Hamas will have just 1/3 of the popular vote, and which means 1/3 of the seats. This is a very different electoral system, Aaron, from the one that we had in 2006, when Hamas was able to win a majority, despite the fact that a majority of seats, despite the fact that it did not win a majority of the popular vote. But Abbas, as you said, is old, and his credibility is very, very low. And there are a lot of other Fatah leaders, secular nationalist leaders, who support a two-state solution and who are a lot more democratic than Abbas. Abbas needs to be encouraged to retire and to allow for greater competition within Fatah. And in my view, if we go to elections with that understanding, that conditions, domestic conditions, could be seriously improved. But in the meanwhile, improved, all the things that Aaron has spoken about, I believe, are excellent ideas for doing exactly that in the short term, to improve Israeli-Palestinian relations and prevent a short-term eruption in Jerusalem or elsewhere. Economic conditions, if improved, could also go a long way in creating that environment. But this is not going to be enough unless elections are held. The entire PA will continue to be seen as lacking in credibility and having no legitimacy, and it will be tiptoeing over every single decision. It will not be able to make any fundamental reforms in the system, and it will not be able to move forward in any serious progress with Israel. Elections is what we need ultimately to to be able to make important decisions.
And the lack of elections, obviously, David, are giving Hamas an opportunity to, stir the pot. We have to close, unfortunately, but kind of tie it all together for us. Is Israel cognizant, willing? I mean, obviously you've talked about Bennett and his, lack of desire for a two-state solution, but you do have Labott, you do have the Israeli public, which I think ultimately does want some kind of solution. Is Israel, what do you expect from this new government in terms of trying to at least improve the situation on the ground? You have intra-Israeli violence, provocations between ultra-nationalists and Palestinians living inside of Israel. It's really a tinderbox of tensions for this new government to deal with. We still have Gaza, responding to some of these provocations by the nationalists and forced to respond. So kind of look ahead for us and tell us what you think, how you think the new Israeli government is going to navigate this.
Okay, I'll try and do this quickly and fix everything in 2 minutes, right? So just, we said, you said before about Hamas's strategic gains. And I think that's something we should, from an Israeli perspective, we should be concerned by. Hamas did marginalize the PA with last month's war. The Israeli army would like to think it, quote unquote, did well. But Hamas marginalized the PA, stirred up East Jerusalem, portrayed itself as the defender of Al-Aqsa, exacerbated tensions within Israel. There was a little bit of rocket fire from Lebanon and from Syria. The Iranians sent a drone. This was a good conflict as far as Hamas is concerned, and Khalil's surveys showed the impact that had. Now that should be worrying for Palestinians who seek freedoms and progress, and it should be worrying for Israel. I think Israel, this government will want to avoid new flashpoints, but that might not be possible. It's not so easy. Sheikh Jarrah, you mentioned it, Aaron, people want to read up more about it. It's spectacularly complicated, and it is potentially incendiary, of course. The Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa is always a potential flashpoint. A very wise friend of mine has often said, the Middle East is the dinner guest that won't go home. Right? It's all very well for the administration to have domestic priorities, but you can't afford to turn your back on the region, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I can't fix anything except a gradual efforts to restore confidence, build confidence. I just think there has to be a gradual approach. And I just think there's a little irony, which is not particularly valuable, but it is ironic. We started this conversation with me talking about Israel's 4 elections in 2 years, and we're lamenting the absence of Palestinian elections for 16 years. So there again, folks, if we could just find the middle ground between us, we could have a few fewer elections. The Palestinians could have just a couple more every now and again. It's kind of got to be that kind of mindset where we can help each other create a different tone. Again, like I said, I've sounded atypically optimistic. Khalil, I think, has brought us all quite nicely back down to earth, but there has to be an effort to somehow, you can't ignore us. The administration should not, for its own interests and for all of ours, the Israelis and the Palestinians, not be overambitious, but try to gradually edge the two sides into some kind of more confident, warmer tone, better dialogue, better communication, set the stage for progress down the road.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but as you can see, there's no better people than David Horovitz, Khalil Shakiki, and Aaron Miller to break this down for us, look at some of the potential areas of common ground and how we move forward. And obviously there's so much more to discuss, but the conversation does not end. I encourage everybody to look at the Times of Israel and the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. David and Khalil's work is so informative and insightful. And obviously Aaron's work at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And you can see Aaron on CNN. I would like to thank my panel. I'd like to thank the 92nd Street Y Talks and all of you for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.